Welcome back to another episode of the Daily Read. Today we're in Romans chapter 11. Get your pen, your pencil, your notebook, maybe your nerd glasses out. It's time to get a little deep here. So Romans chapter 11 is, again, do you remember a few days ago we talked about Romans chapter 9 and how it's just layers upon layers, and it's great, but it's also very deep and complex in a way. That is Romans chapter 11. So I think we compared, if I remember correctly, we compared Romans chapter 9 to baklava. It's I think it's an Eastern European dessert, and it's dough and sugar and lots of layers, and it's just a lot, but it's great. Romans chapter 11, if Romans 9 is baklava, Romans 11 would be like a super complex dish that you would get at like a fusion restaurant, like a really high-end hipster restaurant. What I mean by saying that is Romans 11 has just such nuanced thought and ways of understanding deep contextual things that we by nature in 2020 in rural LaRue County just don't naturally understand, because it's as if reading about let's imagine that we colonize Mars, and in 2300 they're trying to understand the pandemic of 2020. They can read about it because it's obviously going to be in the history books, but to fully understand the context, it's kind of hard because they're living on Mars. They were born there. They weren't even from Earth. You see what I'm saying? There's just a lot of context that makes sense of actually living through it. So Romans 11 is similar to that. It's really dialing up the need for context, because without it, it doesn't make a lot of sense. So, brief history. Remember that all throughout the Old Testament, God chose through the Abrahamic promise. So God came to Abraham, said to him, hey, listen, brother, I'm going to bless the nations through you, through your family. And then Abraham looked at his wife. They were both super old, and they didn't have kids. And he was like, God, how's this going to work? And then God's like, I got it. Don't worry about it. And so they had one kid. Abraham dies. He's got one kid. And it just doesn't feel super hopeful at that point that, this is going to be a major nation. But then it does, and it develops over time, and God begins to work through the Jewish people, or Israel. And so as he is working through them, and his intent is to bless the nations through them, it's very clear that God is working specifically through that group of people. Now, 400 years of silence goes by. Jesus shows up on the scene. He's the baby. Everybody wants to kill him. Not everybody, but a lot of people want to kill him. And then he grows up and he becomes this rabbi. Jewish, obviously. And rabbi just means teacher. And so he's teaching, and he's going around, and he begins healing people. And all of a sudden, the Jewish leaders are upset with him because he is not only being kind, but he is also helping people who are not super Jews, right? Like the Samaritans. In fact, they had this derogatory racist term that they would use called the Samaritans, or they would refer to them as half-breeds, as if the Jewish people had intermarried with Gentile people, so Gentile mean non-Jew, and then all of a sudden they weren't purebloods. And that's deeply racist, not okay. And so Jesus is interacting with these people and treating them with value, dignity, and respect. And then all of a sudden, the Jews are very upset with this, and they're like, we're going to kill him. And so they do kill him. Unfortunately for them, he's God, so he rose from the dead. Kind of spoiled that idea and plan. So Romans 11 comes along, and it begins to unpack for us in the early church that there is still a deeply racial divide, right? So those Jews who had become followers of Jesus were just seeing Jesus as the promised Messiah, a natural progression in the evolution of their faith, in the sense of what had been promised, had come, they believed, etc. They were having a hard time, though, with these Gentiles coming in. And so Paul uses this, I love this illustration. I've gotten into gardening, and so the idea of grafting, where basically you take a cut off of one plant and you graft it by cutting something off the original plant and putting it on a cut from the new plant and kind of binding it with, twine or some type of way to hold it on there, and then eventually they grow together and this new thing comes. And so that being said, that he's using this example that the Israel, because they didn't believe that branches were broken off. And so what happens then is the Gentiles are grafted in. What's interesting about that to me is that they were having a hard time with it, the Jews were. And so Paul says this, For if God did not spare the natural branches, neither will he spare you. Note, then the kindness and the severity of God. Severity towards those who have fallen, but God's kindness to you, provided you continue in his kindness. Otherwise, you too will be cut off. And even they, if they do not continue in their unbelief, will be grafted in, for God has the power to graft them in again. For if you were cut from what is by nature a wild olive tree and grafted, contrary to nature, into a cultivated olive tree, how much more will these, the natural branches, be grafted back into their own olive tree? So you've got a lot of feelings on both sides of this. You've got the Gentiles who were upset at being treated as if they didn't belong, and then you've got the Jews upset that the Gentiles didn't belong. And so what Paul is saying is, hey guys, get over it. You're both now here together. And so when I think we try to bring that into understanding in 2020, I think it actually communicates a lot of helpful things to us, specifically in how we think about not only those who are in the church, but in those who have yet to believe. Now, it's not a direct application, what I'm about to say, but I think the spirit of it is helpful to consider. So when we look at people outside of the church who are not Christians, sometimes we can have thoughts towards them of, well, I don't want to go to those people because they're scary, or I don't want to go to these people because it's outside of my comfort zone, they're not like me, etc. But the heart of what I believe Romans 11 is getting at is that the invitation to believe is to everyone. The Jews had to recognize the invitation to believe had gone on to the Gentiles, these people who they did not particularly like or care for, but now realize we're being invited into the family. And so for us, that might look like us going to people who are unlike us, demographics, skin color, ways of believing, etc., and inviting them into the family of God with the good news of the gospel. And so when we begin to look at Romans 11, it is deeply, deeply dependent on context and understanding things. But I think the major heart of it is saying, hey, listen, part of what God's kingdom is an invitation to belong to all of humanity. To all of humanity. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. Everyone is invited to the table. And see, the thing we know about heaven is that there will be people there from every tribe, tongue, and nation. And so what does that say to us today? Well, it says that just because somebody's skin color is different than us, that doesn't give us the right to treat them any differently. In fact, to treat them differently because of their skin color is not only racist, but it's deeply sinful. To treat someone differently because they're from a different country is not only xenophobic, but it's sinful. To treat someone different because they are from a different socioeconomic group than us is not only rude, but it's deeply sinful. Because the thing that we realize in all of Scripture, especially in Romans in the early chapters, is if there is one great equalizer, it's sin. Sin brings us all down to a point of saying, you have messed up and you do not deserve the grace of God. But yet He gives it to us. But God, as the word says. So let Romans 11 deeply reshape how we think about the church, how it should look, that it should be a place that represents a hospital for those who are sick and who are in need of help. And that's going to be everybody from all different walks of life, every look, everything. So let Romans 11 be our heartbeat, that God is in the business of grafting in people who do not belong technically to the group. Love you guys. We'll see you tomorrow for Romans chapter 12.